Hey, this is Matthew Ellison, President and Church Missions Coach at 1650. It is our passion to equip the body of Christ for the mission of God. And one of the ways we do that is providing content just like this webinar. We hope you're blessed by what you hear today. And if you have comments or questions, please leave them right here.
Matthew Ellison, President of 1615. So glad you are here today. Looking forward to today's webinar, Characteristics of a Church Honoring Mission Agency. And I'm happy to have Denny Spitters with us today. He's going to be presenting, and also we have a special guest who will come on at the end for some question and answer. Now, in just a moment, we're going to start the webinar, but just a few preliminary things. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. So you can listen in through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, and we certainly hope that they do, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We're going to be addressing your questions for about the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together. And again, let me encourage you, this is your opportunity to enter into the conversation with myself, Denny, and with our special guest. 115 people have registered for today's webinar. Want to let everyone know this webinar will be recorded and it'll be available for viewing probably in about 4 or 5 days. So once again, thank you so much for being here today. This topic is near and dear to our heart. We have a real passion at 1615 to mobilize the local church to be a central player and full partner in missions. And we trust because you're on this webinar, you have that same passion. So just a few questions to start off today. I'm not going to open it up, but this is more food for thought for you personally. As an organization, do you believe there is a biblical basis for agencies to engage with and mobilize local churches? Do you believe there's a biblical precedent or philosophy that should move agencies towards the church, not away from the church? And then what are some practical reasons agencies should engage in partnership with local churches? What are some of those very tactical, practical reasons that make sense for churches to pursue meaningful partnerships with churches? Just think about that for just a moment as we begin this webinar. Well, we certainly believe there's a lot of answers to those questions, and we believe that the local church is a God-designed central player, and there are also very practical, strategic reasons why agencies should engage with local churches. So to start off, I want to look at Hebrews 13, verse 4 and 5. So in my nearly 30 years in missions mobilization, I have encountered many people inside missions agencies who know that biblically speaking, local churches have a key role to play in world missions. But practically speaking, they would rather local churches provide money, people, and just kind of get out of the way so that the agencies can get the job done. And working with churches for some folks in agencies is not something they desire or something that brings them joy. But come on, it's got to be done, and so they do it somewhat begrudgingly. Now, let me say I can relate. To be sure, the churches with whom we are all familiar embody various levels of imperfection, just like our missions organizations. But here's the thing. This does not alter the magnificence of God's original design. On the contrary, what it does, it provides a backdrop that highlights the breathtaking dimensions of God's grace in the face of human waywardness. Make no mistake. Jesus is going to build and perfect his church. He will complete his work. He's revealed this to us. And as missions mobilizers, again, I trust that's why you're online today, we have the amazing privilege of loving, nurturing, teaching, and leading local churches into the exalted role that God has for them. So on my anniversary, several years back, I was journaling some of my thoughts like I usually do on my anniversary. By the way, my wife, Renee, and I just celebrated 27 years together in March. So I'd been thinking a great deal about contentment. And so I was meditating on Hebrews 13, 4 and 5. Again, I want to use this verse to set the tone for this webinar. The writer of Hebrews says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep yourselves free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So here's just a bit of my journal entry. Father, when you gave me Renee, you were in essence giving some of yourself to me, one of your daughters, one of your own. To not be content with her is to not be content with you. You instruct me to keep the marriage bed pure, undefiled, and to be free from the love of money. And then you let me know that you will never leave or forsake me. So to not be content with my wife and with what you have given me is basically saying that your presence and your gifts to me are not enough. Now, what on earth does this have to do with mobilizing churches? Much, my friends. If marriage is designed by God to be a living parable that puts on display the wonderful divine realities that have to do with Jesus's love affair with his bride, the church, then I think for those of us who relate to and work with churches, the actual bride of Christ, a person, if you will, a woman, the metaphor of marriage is profound. When we're not content with local churches, so to speak, and we would rather bypass our relationship with them to accomplish the task of world missions, might we be saying to Christ, we're not content with your plan. It's not working. We're going to find another way. It's more practical, more pragmatic. We're going to look elsewhere. Now, I may be reaching here, but when agencies view local churches simply as a means to accomplish their ends or as a source for funding, and they write local churches out of God's mission, I think we're defiling our relationship with his bride. So I want to talk about why we should prioritize the mobilization of local churches. This is more of the biblical philosophy. Woven in are some practical reasons as well. One, I believe it's biblical. God has a glorious vision for his church. He's his bride. He loves her. He's going to make known his manifold wisdom through here. That's what Paul tells the church in Ephesus. The manifold wisdom of God might be made known through the church. That's profound. So it is biblical. He is perfecting his church, and he's going to secure glory for himself through his church. George Miley says this: to say the church is an awesome resource is an understatement, somewhat condescending. She's more than that. She is a God-designed central player and a full partner. So we believe, again, it is biblical. Ed Stetzer, in our book Conversations on When Everything is Missions, says the church is God's plan A for advancing his mission in the world. There is no plan B. Now, I'm not sure if Ed's the first one to come up with that, but he definitely said it in our book, so I'll give him attribution. But folks, sit on that for a minute. There is no plan B. The church is God's plan A for advancing his mission in the world, which means mission agencies should be thinking carefully and intentionally about what it means to mobilize and partner with local churches. This is also from George Miley. He says, as we enter the third millennium of the Christian era, there is widespread awareness that the energy and capacity of the missions movement would be appreciably enhanced if we could bring more local churches into meaningful involvement. He goes on to say the vast majority of resources God has given to his people, they're in churches, folks. Spiritual gifts, vocational expertise, capacity for spiritual warfare, you name it, they are in churches. So how do we mobilize those resources and see them directed to God's mission? It's also strategic, and Miley hit on that a little bit. But John Piper says all the resources needed to send and support an army of self-sacrificing, joy-spreading ambassadors is in the church. Again, the vast majority of resources, people resources, human resources, spiritual resources, God has placed in churches. It can also increase effectiveness. Partnership can leverage resources, abilities, opportunities, giftedness, and ideas. You see, what churches bring is knowledge and insight and creativity that protects us as organizations from our blind side, from doing things the way they've always been done. Oftentimes, working with churches, we just see things a little differently when we put ourselves in their shoes and see things from their perspective. It can increase the time frame of fulfilling a vision or mission. Now, to be clear, working with churches takes time. It requires patience, and sometimes you got to go slow to go fast, if you will. But over the long period of time, it can actually decrease the time frame. It can lead to greater impact. It can produce healthy accountability that agencies definitely need. And it can result in shared, celebrated outcomes. This is one of the best things that comes out of meaningful partnerships with churches. I talked to many agencies who've taken the time to strategically and generously invest in relationships with churches, And what comes out of it is this joy, this koinonia partnership that comes when we work with others in a cause larger than ourselves and bigger than our own interests. How about this one? Why mobilize churches? Because the Great Commission can't fail. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So the Great Commission's fulfillment through the church, folks, is not impossible. It is inevitable. It's going to happen. Again, Jesus is going to build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So these are reasons why we should prioritize the mobilization of local churches as missions organizations. Steve Barron, a great book called Well Sent, Reimagining the Church's Missionary Sending Process, says this. It's really a profound statement. I think it demystifies church and agency partnerships. And that's not to say that they're not complicated, that they're not messy, but we make them harder than they really are at times. He says the church is to be the sender of missionaries and the agency the facilitator. The church has most, but not all of the resources. And the agency has most, but not all of the expertise. It makes sense to bring them together for productive ministry. It is important to know that going it alone often results in the duplication of efforts and a lack of expertise. So I've laid the why foundation, why I believe missions orgs should pursue partnerships with churches. I'm going to ask Denny to hop on now. He's going to talk about the what. What are the characteristics of missions organizations that honor and esteem churches? So Denny, if you want to join us, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate it so much. We're going to look at 5 characteristics. I want to welcome you all today. I'm glad that you're a part of this, whether you're a church or an agency. It's important that we understand that there are characteristics that are very, very critical. And of course, the question is, why are these critical characteristics so critical? I thought, well, don't we want to see the Great Commission? We just read Matthew 24:14. Don't we want to see the Great Commission message and worship of Christ our King advance to all nations, tribes, and tongues in a Revelation 7:9 or 5:9 fulfillment? Of course we do. Well, if so, then agencies need to know that it's imperative that we value and understand the local church. History shows that when we work together cooperatively and interdependently, the Great Commission movement thrives and advances, and attempts of control by either one results in the curtailment of the Great Commission movement and the emphasis, competition, and duplication of efforts, which are the opposite of some of the things in terms of effectiveness that Matthew just showed. I also think mission agencies must confidently recognize their vital facilitative role without de-emphasizing the significant role of the local church. And agencies need to temper potential extremism that dismisses partnership with local churches. And I think we've all been a part of that. I would sheepishly raise my hands, knowing that I've said things or had attitudes toward the church out of frustration, disappointment, wanting to see her be so much more in mission than many times she is. I'd like to re-engage as well this whole idea of cultivation. Agency must cultivate a posture and an approach that is a loving mixture of service, invitation, and prophetic awareness. We need to be able to say to her, come join us, be a part of this, and pick up what is your rightful role in this. But we have to have the right posture. I think that's one of the key pieces that we really need to talk about and think through. So moving from interdependence to dependence, I want to bring back the quote as well in a minute, demystifying the church's kind of this idea that the church is no longer to be the sender of missionaries only and the agency to be the facilitator. The church has most, but not all of the resources, and the agency has most, but not all of the expertise. So it makes sense to bring these two parties together. I love that. It's important to know that going it alone, as Steve calls it, often results in the duplication of efforts and a lack of expertise. So it's really, really critical that we understand that there are two key roles that each of them play: the church as the sender, the agency as the facilitator. So what are the helpful characteristics and postures for agencies with churches, and how can we be empathetic but persistent and prophetic? I think by respecting the church's role and really inviting her into a deeper and more meaningful engagement. And it's important that we're not demanding in that, and that our attitudes and postures are the very things that should fuel, I call them high touch moments. These moments when we are communicating very clearly with churches and speaking to them not only about who we are, but really identifying where they are in the process, so that we can move from an independent sort of thinking to more interdependence. So let's just go through some of these step by step and look at these characteristics and traits, or marks, if you want to call them. And I'm going to just hit on them quickly. Cherishing. Does your agency, does your team hold something that's precious and dear? Do they hold and demonstrate a loving desire for the church? To cherish means to hold dear, or to hold precious, to feel love for. And there's all sorts of metaphors in the Bible for this. All the way to Jesus talking about the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And of course, when he finds it of great value, he sells everything and buys it. To husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So this whole idea that we are giving, and our posture is one of a desire to want to understand and listen well. So do you love and cherish the church that Jesus died for? That's kind of a great question. Think about that a minute. We just saw Ed attributed to saying the church is his plan A and there's no plan B. So my question would be, is your plan A his plan A? Or do you have a different view and plan? Does your agency in any way demonstrate a loving desire for the church beyond maybe some platitudes? How is that love expressed and demonstrated? And what does your posture of cherishing and really valuing look like? Next one is listening. What generative posture do you project for the purpose of partnership? Is your listening simply a download for your opportunity to kind of get in the face of a church and sell what your agency has to offer? Do you ever ask questions that elicit empathy? Do you have any questions that draw churches in, such as, what ways of doing missions is most important to your church? Or another one might be, what are the current biggest challenges you are facing in your missions ministry? Or simply, what is going well? What are you struggling with? What are the most helpful ways that a mission agency can relate to your church? Rather than questions that simply advance my agenda, which is questions of, hey, do you have some people that I could get in contact with to be able to recruit them for something we're trying to, rather really taking the approach of building partnership from a place of understanding and listening well, and creating what I like to call a generative listening environment that, once again, elicits interdependence rather than independence. Next one, praying. How is prayer for churches modeled? What does it look like in your culture? Do you pray at all for them? Is there anything systematized and included in their engagement so that you're praying for them? Do you have any prayer rituals or emphases that you're bringing to bear that focus on the local church and what they need? You never know how the opportunity you might have unfolds just through the ministry of prayer. Think about this, most pastors and leaders are rarely prayed for, if ever, but they are regularly asked to, Pastor, will you pray for me? Pray for me. Pastor, pray for this. Pastor, pray for that. This is an excellent opportunity for us to minister to the body of Christ at large as we engage with churches. Contextualizing. Every church is unique and different. A one-size-fits-all prepackaged approach will be a non-starter. If we as agencies are training sent cross-cultural workers to contextualize the gospel well in other places, why are we resistant to do the same in our churches in our own context? What do our organization postures and activities reveal about how we are perceived by local churches? Perception is usually reality for most churches with agencies. So this whole idea of really understanding that each church is unique, even if it has the same denominational label, is really critical to engaging well, listening well, and to zeroing in on uniting together in a place of interdependence. Investing. Here's a question. What can you point to, if anything, that blesses the local church? Anything. Is the majority of your communication written, electronic, virtual, face-to-face, laden with lots of quid pro quo hints or suggestions or demands? Is there anything you can truly point back to as an investment that you are making in the local church? As agencies, I get it, we're often consumed with ourselves, our mission, and there's more work to go around than we have people to fill those roles. Remember, if the local church of obedient followers of Jesus is God's plan A, there is no plan B. There is still a remnant of churches today who are really seeking and needing encouragement and invitation. So how might your agency invest in churches? Have you ever even asked churches what they need from you or how you might bless them? That is a great question to ask and can elicit some excellent opportunities to come alongside, especially churches and leaders that at times are really hurting in the culture that we're living in today. Collaborating. Yes, collaboration. True partnership is when your success is my success and your failure is my failure. It is literally tying yourself so closely together that there is a mutuality in winning and losing. So is your success or failure tied to the local church at any point? no matter how difficult things get in our future, we must lovingly ask the church to regain her missions vision and invite her into Jesus's great commission imperatives. But it has to be through collaboration together. And that will mean probably dying to some old ways so that a new relationship and new ways might emerge. If we're to move from independence to interdependence, we must bring a humble approach of invitation, and collaboration actually means co-laboring together. By the way, I think that this should include what we say about each other when we hear from churches. What I say about agency Z and what I say about agency A ought to really undergird my appreciation for them rather than kind of tearing them down or trying to say disparagement in some ways upon them. So when a church says, hey, we really have this great relationship with ABC agency, and it's a collaborating partner that they really love, do you applaud and then ask why? Why is that? Tell me about that relationship and what's going on. Well, assessment is a key part of all of this. And before we kind of move into questions, we have to look at these sorts of questions to evaluate where we're at. I want to lead this with a quote from Henry Ford, maybe not very spiritual, but he said something that was very, very important, I think. Henry Ford said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. So if you're looking as an agency or as an individual who's a part of an agency to really affect culture within your agency, we have to ask these questions. What does the assessment of these characteristics reveal about your reality? How do you steward and how are you stewarding your relationship with the bride of Christ? So if church leaders or pastors were asked for their honest input, how would their feedback align with your personal assessment? What do your protocols and postures of communication look like? How will a new assessment possibly take root and then affect the status quo? I think these are really important questions to really work through and think through. Obviously, it's something that we do more intensely, walking you through and giving you a chance to do this at the MAC, which you're going to hear about later, the mission agency consultation. But taking the time to think through these questions and actually getting feedback from your churches is incredibly valuable. So I want to encourage you today, if you are wrestling somehow maybe with what to do in these areas, we want to encourage you and we want to strengthen you in any way that we possibly can.
Denny, thank you, brother. You know, I've heard this content 20 times and it always hits home. It's never old. It's always fresh because it's always relevant. And I remember it was probably 7 or 8 years ago when we came together in Albuquerque and spent several days in an upper room at 1615's old office. And we really thought through prayerfully, what does a church honoring organization look like? And that was really the impetus for what we now call the mission agency consultation and even some of these qualities that you mentioned here. I just want to hit on this briefly. Denny talked about these characteristics, but if these characteristics are just, words hanging on a wall or platitudes, they're not going to infect the organizational culture that you have. They have to be pressed. I love this quote from Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. Unless you deliberately press your values to be in alignment with your vision, you end up losing your vision because lesser values and cultural habits of the heart will prevail and your vision eventually fades. And this was directed towards local churches developing a missions culture, but it applies to agencies as well, developing a church honoring culture. And in a nutshell, what it says is you don't become an organization that esteems and honors local churches accidentally. It requires intentionality. And sometimes you have to address those lesser values and cultural habits of the heart that are actually impediments to meaningful partnership with churches. So one of the things we do at the MAC is we talk about who do you need to become, but also who do you need to unbecome? Are there habits of the heart that are actually detracting churches from you? They're preventing you from meaningful partnerships. I was just with the president of a large missions organization, and he told me that if they're not intentional about partnership with local churches, they trend away from churches because they do what's most efficient, they do which is practical or pragmatic. He said you have to fight for a church honoring culture, but it's worth it. And so as Denny presented those characteristics, just think about that. Intentionality is definitely required. So the mission agency consultation, Denny mentioned that. We've been at this for about 7 or 8 years now, as already mentioned. And once a year, we may eventually go to 2 based on demand, but we gather agency leaders from organizations around the country, some from around the world as well, church partnership divisions within those organizations, mobilization teams within those organizations, and we spend 2 days really thinking about what does a church honoring organization actually look like. It will be held in Dallas area, June 7th and 8th, 2023. Again, it's 2 days. We encourage organizations to not just send executives, but a handful of people, church partnership folks, mobilization folks, because we really want to see these characteristics permeate the organizations that go through the mission agency consultation. Just a few things here. Is the mission agency consultation something that you should consider? Well, one of the things we'll address is how do churches perceive your organizations? We do some empathy mapping here, and we have participants think themselves into the position of local churches. What does it look like to be in the shoes of a local church when they're approached by our organization? This is really big. Understanding how churches perceive your organization. And Danny already hit on this. How does your organization perceive and view churches? Are you doing missions for churches or with them? And there's a massive difference there. And so we discussed that. We talked a great bit about cultivating a pro-church culture and then connecting what you do best to what churches do best. We don't encourage organizations to become something they're not, but how do they present that value proposition in such a way to churches that it honors churches and it enhances Great Commission activity? And then does your organization really know the church in North America? So these are some of the things that we address at the MAC. We deal with philosophy, but also we get very practical, helping you identify next steps to seeing these ideas permeate your organization. So we have a special guest with us today, a dear friend of mine, Rebecca P. Rebecca, if you could turn your camera on, I'm going to do the same. And Denny, you're welcome to join us as well. Great to see you, Rebecca, and Denny, good to see you as well. Rebecca, just give us a nutshell. Who are you? Your audio is not working on my end, Rebecca.
Amazing. It would be so great if I unmuted myself. It's amazing. So you think we'd be pros at this by now, but that's okay. I live in the North Texas area. I work for an organization called Cafe 1040. We have a missions mobilization mentorship program for young adults seeking clarity and confidence in a calling to unreached people groups. And I've worked with I've been with the company for 7 mobilization team for a few years. And then the last couple of years, I've been serving on our staff care team doing spiritual development. So it's a great work.
Well, Rebecca, I'm so glad you're here today. Thank you for taking time. You were at the inaugural mission agency consultation. Again, Denny and I had been working together for years and really felt there was a need for a resource and some coaching and consulting to help mission organizations really understand what it means to build, I would say, meaningful and fruitful, not just meaningful, but fruitful partnerships with churches. And Cafe 1040 showed up at that first one. And I'm curious, what was going on at Cafe that made you say, this is important? I mean, because it takes time, it takes financial investment, but you felt the need to come. What was going on at Cafe that made you feel like this was a good step for you?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Matthew. When I first came to the MAC, I guess it was back in 2017, I was fresh on staff. I think I've been on staff for maybe a year. And I had come from an organization where my primary responsibility was cultivating relationships with local churches, partnering with them, linking arms in ministry. I was working for a children's advocacy group. And so working in the missions world doing this was really new to me. And so coming in, I was like, well, surely we have a fully formed strategy. And we didn't. We had a heart for the mobilization of the local church, but really our stronger passion was for the mobilization of individuals. We really wanted to mobilize individuals, but we didn't have a lot of words or language or policies or practices around how do we mobilize individuals in the context of their local church. Because we can't just take these individuals, send them overseas, bring them back home, and expect them to be healthy church members. And so the more that I dug in at our organization and started asking questions, the more I realized that we didn't really know. We didn't really have great policies and procedures that guided that high view of the local church that you talk about all the time. So, from an organizational perspective, to be really blunt, we knew what we wanted to get from a relationship with churches, like opportunity to connect with mission-minded young adults for our mentorship program, but we didn't really know how to take a servant's posture toward the church that would allow us to have fruitful relationships that were honoring to the church and not just taking from her. So I came because I heard good things about you and good things about 1615, and I raised a little support, and I was like, well, might as well, we make time for the things that matter, and it mattered to me personally. So I decided to give it a go.
So you talk about posture, and Denny really hits on this a lot during the MAC, and so do I, but this is really in his wheelhouse. Denny, I'm going to ask you to surface something that you talk about during the MAC, and it might stick out in Rebecca's mind, but you talk about the heart of the intervener often determines the outcome of the intervention. And by intervention, I don't mean, confronting someone with addiction, just any interaction. So you could say the heart of the person interacting determines the outcome of the interaction. So the person coming in, can you talk a little bit about the heart posture that agencies need to have as they interact with churches?
Yeah, I think so many times we as agency personnel we're pumped up. We're excited about the ministry that God has given us, and we feel so deeply that we need to bring to the church these opportunities that we have in this process. And often I think we don't even necessarily mean to, but that heart of the intervener, in other words, the one that's coming into the equation, is often a heart that is, we have to do this. We have to do this now. We have to. And so it's very, at times demanding, at times maybe a little too strong. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be convinced and convicted about our roles and what we're doing. We need to be very passionate about them, but we need to understand what the church hears on the other side. And that's where the heart of the intervener is so important. If we come with a humble approach, we can be very direct and very forthright and still draw people in. And often that intervention, it tends to lack questions. it tends to bring statements, like, do you know that 2% of the, and so on and so forth. And that's where the heart of the intervener, I think, bubbles up.
Yeah.
And we need to recognize what that looks like to the local.
Yeah, it's good. So there's something I call the Acts 20:28 pause. And in Acts 20:28, Paul talks about the blood-bought church. He's talking about protecting them from, vicious wolves. But the idea is this church was purchased with blood. And I remind myself when I'm making a phone call, I try to, or I'm driving on a church property, I'm going to interact with sons and daughters of the living God, purchased with the blood of Jesus. It completely changes my posture of heart. So I really appreciate that, brother. Rebecca, tell me, what was the most meaningful thing you learned at the MAC? Were there any aha moments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we had the opportunity to cultivate in our hearts, and this is kind of going off of what Denny said just a second ago, we have to, as agency professionals, we have to have a posture of humility. Because so often, just like Denny said, we come in with this statements. We're very passionate people. We've leveraged our careers and many of us are on support, and we've like had all of our friends and our family invest in us to do this thing, like for the glory of God among the nations. But we forget that we are members of the body of Christ also. And there are so many words in the scriptures that Jesus and Paul have for us about approaching the body with humility and with reverence and with joy and with affection and with one anotherness. So the MAC really allows you as an organizational professional to press pause on your zeal and on your strategy and all the things that you think are best for the church, and self-examine. And just ask, like, am I even approaching the church the way that the scriptures would have me? I think I was really able to put flesh on that phrase. Matthew, you say it all the time, having a high view of the local church. My understanding of that phrase, I thought I knew what it meant, but I found out it was like looking through dirty glasses, which that's gross. So I think so many organizations, they'll say with their mouths, and think that they show, I have a high view of the church. I don't talk nasty about her. Like, I try to have healthy partnerships, but we haven't taken the time to to pull apart the layers of all of our processes and procedures to really say, like, do I really, at all levels of the organization, like if I asked anybody in the organization, what is our posture toward the church? Everybody in the organization should be able to articulate that high view, because it's going to ooze out of you somehow. And I loved, last thing I'll say about the aha moments for me, I loved the empathy mapping exercise. I think you called it Chuck Church, so I've heard you call it Cheryl Church or two, but that exercise was really helpful for me. I want for people to understand, when you enter into the space of the MAC, this is not Matthew and Denny's 87 rules to make all the churches out there love you. That's not what it is. They're not going to give you this church in a box strategy. They are going to help you self-examine, to cultivate humility, and to have a realistic picture of how you can adjust your own heart to have beautiful, flourishing relationships with the church. So, yeah.
One of that's so well said. One of the things I'd like to emphasize that you said so well, because often I see this in the agency and org world. Well, working with churches, that's the job of the church partnership or church relationships team or whoever it's been assigned to. That has nothing to do with the rest of us. I work in finance, or I work in yada, yada, yada. I mobilize. I don't really, and I'm like, that's the problem. That actually is part of the problem, is that, like you said, when you peel back the layers, you're like, every interaction with a church is an interaction for a high touch moment where that church is listening, not so much to the very words you say, but the heart, the spirit, the attitude, and they're picking up a lot from that. So even the person that answers the phone and helps the church through a process of, we sent that check, or we made that payment, or is that mission? those are the moments where we communicate high value.
Amen.
Rebecca, one more question, and then we're going to open it up to our audience here and allow them to interact with you, because you were an agency that's been through it a couple times. You made this a part of your culture, part of the ongoing conversation, which I think is so important. Tell me about the other side of MAC. You hinted at some of these things already, but what changes did it lead to? How did the Spirit of God work through it, where you're actually experiencing impact as an organization?
Yeah, other than me becoming a champion of the MAC and making us go every time. So it's great. Well, Matthew, I think there's two things that really stand out to me in terms of the other side, and I could list so many for you. Very, very practical things about manuals, policies, procedures that changed. But two bigger things. One of the things that was meaningful for me, we all have branding language externally that we talk to audiences about what we do. Right? We've got our vision, our mission statement. We can all recite it. So Cafe 1040, we lead a generation to tell the story of Jesus where it's never been told until they're disciples of Jesus among all people groups, right? And all my coworkers that are watching say amen. But we started to develop an internal branding language about not just what we do, but how we do what we do. And it was a long process where all of our staff were involved, but I just want to read it to you because it's so beautiful. This was not part of our culture before the MAC. So the way that we describe to one another, and even to our external audiences about how we do what we do, is that we work alongside the local church to guide the next generation of missionaries through the process of hearing and seeing and doing their role in the Great Commission, to tell the story of Jesus where it's never been told. But it's that at the very beginning, it's that working alongside the local church. So everything in our mission and our vision and how we do what we do has to be filtered through that lens. And then the other thing that was important for me, we had our, most mission organizations, you meet every 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it is, as a global team. So we had an opportunity in January of this year to meet as a global staff. All our stateside overseas workers met overseas. We have only a few days together. And our whole staff is there. We could talk about anything. And there's a lot of really important things that we need to talk about. We gave an entire session to what it looks like for our organization to humble ourselves with the bride of Christ and to work alongside the local church. Yeah. And it was, I'm sitting there, I gave part of the presentation, but one of my dear coworkers, Alex, she's brilliant and wonderful. She was giving part of the presentation, and I'm just sitting watching her and watching all the eyes on her and going, this is the moment. Back in 2017, this was a dream for me that it would become part of our organizational ethos, and now it is. And it's I have so many people to thank, you guys, for that, but so much is different on the other side. But just know that it took a lot of time, a lot of hard conversations, a lot of patience, and honestly, hours of me and my team going to the Father, asking for humility and asking for patience and asking him to change the culture of our organization, because the Father is so kind and so generous to do the things that are on our hearts like that. So other side, we look totally different, and it's been a joy.
Wow, how encouraging for us to hear that. And yeah. I'm reminded of something that Phil Smith from Pioneer Bible Translators has been sharing with me lately. Denny and I did an on-site consultation with PBT, Pioneer Bible Translators, and some of the language that he is now communicating to his team. And like you, they're saying this is not, meaningful relationships with churches or a high view of churches is not the job of the church partnership team. We want to see that permeate the organization and integrate it. But in his emails, he has this phrase he's been putting on at the end of his emails. Does our interaction with the bride cause Jesus to smile or frown? And just that idea that you're mentioning, I think it is so important to, I don't need to say much more. You really nailed it there. Let me remind everyone online, this is your opportunity to talk to Rebecca, to talk to Danny, to talk to myself. It could be specific questions about the MAC. It could be questions about the content today. We also welcome pushback, to be fair, we need to say this right now. We're not naive. We know that it's difficult to work with churches. Again, they embody various levels of imperfection, just like our orgs do. So we just want you to know we don't have this, Pollyanna view of churches. We know what it's like out there in the trenches, but it doesn't change God's plan. So this is your opportunity. And if you're not going to post questions, I'll ask questions, but this is your chance. I have one here from Mike. You may have hit on this already, Rebecca, but can we hear a story about what partnership with churches looks like for ideas and inspiration? So you've talked a little bit about posture culture. Do you have anything specific that you could share?
Yeah, I think so. I think we had to shift and change. Hopefully this answers your question, Mike. I think there's a lot of different ways I think we could answer, but we had to shift and change the language that we were using with churches when we sat down and had meetings with them. And so I think that we work with a lot of young adults who are coming from churches and who are really zealous to go overseas and explore the world. And we want to help them do that too. But we realized that instead of coming to a pastor and saying, hey, your young adult is coming with us, and I hope that's okay, and please support them and give them money and pray for them, that'd be great. Because I mean, in the past, we wouldn't even have that meeting with pastors. Somebody would apply for our program and we're like, sweet, we got one. Send them overseas. And then the first step was us for like, we should be talking to pastors. Like, it's not fair for us to just like rip this young adult out of the church community and then put them back in and hope that they don't throw stones. And then the conversation for us even evolved and shifted a little bit more, where we would sit down with the pastor and say, hey, this young adult has a passion and an interest for missions. How can we work together to help fan this flame, to cultivate it in a way that helps and supports and loves your church, you as a pastor, that church culture and community. So I think that's one is how we're communicating with the pastor, inviting them into that conversation, and really taking that, not to beat a dead horse, but like that posture of humility that I don't know this young adult. I don't know the culture of your church, but you do. So I'd love to hear, like, how can I encourage this young adult to submit to the authority and the leadership of their local church, to serve and love their local church? What would it look like? What do I need to say to this young person in order to pass on this high view of the church? And then also, I think we, a lot of times, are mobilizers. We think we want to be the ones that are in that mobilizing, discipling relationship with these young people, but there are already people in their church that can do that. They just don't know where to look for them. So sometimes it's not me thinking I can have all of these mobilization, discipleship relationships, but meeting with the pastors and saying, like, man, I'd love to support you and be a resource for you, but can we help these young adults to find each other in your church and to meet with one another? And that's happened several times, where the young adults, the mission-minded young adults, they start meeting with each other in the church, and then we don't even have to participate. So hopefully that answered your question, but changing the conversation and how you mobilize.
There's a quote, I think Peter Drucker said it originally, but culture eats vision and strategy for breakfast. And I know there's a lot of orgs that have a vision to partner with churches, that even have a strategy, but they don't have the culture, right? And so culture comes first. But this next question deals with practicality, because you need the right heart posture, but then there has to be practical plans. What does that look like? And so day one is really philosophy on the Mac. Second day, we get real practical. Denny, can you talk about that just for a moment, about a church engagement strategy and some of the practical elements that they'll learn about? So we're dealing not just with the heart, but we're dealing with the head and the hands as well.
Yeah, in fact, Rebecca just mentioned a great example, gave a great example of what I call high touch moment. It's a moment where you're really engaging the church, and you're engaging it in such a way that you're inviting relationship to happen. And, she said, hey, before we just take them and go do our thing. Now we're like, oh, well, what if we engage with the church? So I think one of the things that's really important is just trying to map out in your process of what you do in an organization where those moments should be or can be. And often they're much earlier than you think. I'll never forget the day that a missions pastor of a church, said in front of our leadership, Why do you make me the bad guy? Why do you let someone go through the process of your process and I hear about it after they've already been through it, but you, and Rebecca mentioned this, and you don't know them. You don't know what I know. And they may not be the qualified person that you're observing from a distance. So I think that those are some of the practical things. And out of that, I think one of the things our org decided was right from the get-go, if someone said, hey, I want to apply to just begin a process, we would contact their sending church and simply say, hey, Jim and Jane are starting the process. We're excited about that. If you have any questions, if there are any way that, and it's remarkable sometimes some of the things that you get back, because people are like, wow, thanks so much for making this, and it's a simple email. And so thinking through what those pieces are going to be like, and then how much energy do you place in certain situations, because we all have a limited number of energy. So one of the things we talk about is the idea of bringing some sort of a categorization to this grouping of churches we are going to do these specific things with. And this other group of churches, we're going to do this specific. You could have 3 or 4 categories, and you can make them whatever you want to, but you identify the churches in terms of where they are in the Great Commission, where they are with your organization, and then determine how will we move forward and encourage those churches and increase and engage relationship. So.
Yeah, building on that second day really gets practical. Thinking through, what does a church engagement strategy look like? Call it a continuum, pathway, whatever. But what does it look like for us to engage with churches, understanding that not every church is the same, given our limited resources as organizations? And I think that's really helpful. It becomes systemic, it becomes part of the plan. And as you often mentioned, Denny, it's more art than science.
It is.
It's difficult sometimes, but it's worth it to go through that energy here.
Well,
I want to address a couple.
It's based on relationship, and relationships are messy. I've been married for 51 years, and it's been nothing but smooth from day one. And if you believe that, right? All of these relationships, they take work. And so if we just kind of shuffle that aside and say, we're not going to invest in that work, we're just going to do our work alone, we're going to miss out on a lot of great things that God can do. Rebecca mentioned one. Well, hey, why don't you have the pastor's like, well, let's have the young adults in our church start meeting. Great. You know, that's a work that comes through relationship.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. Well, we're at the end of the hour here. This obviously we're plugging the Mac, but understand something. We hope these characteristics, whether or not you come to the mission agency consultation, that you will prayerfully think about them and the implications they might have in the context of your organization. And we've given them to you. We obviously do a much deeper dive at the MAC, but you have these characteristics that we believe really embody an organization that has a high view of local churches. And so hopefully they'll be the basis for some conversation inside your orgs. But we would welcome 2 days with you. And again, let me say this, the reason we have such a high view of churches is because we also have a high view of agencies, para-church, with the church. And so we shouldn't go at it alone. We want to bring those together. One final question for you, Rebecca. Why should agencies go to the consultation in June? Besides, they're going to see you there.
I was going to be like, because I'm there, but that sounds really arrogant. I'm so sorry. All of you know. I'm just kidding. Come, I'll give you a hug. So I think, yes, speaking directly to those who are like considering the investment, I would say, like, if you are serious about having an organization that has healthy and thriving posture toward the church and healthy church honoring partnerships, then I think this is an essential first step. Even if you feel like you guys have a thriving church partnership department or what arm of your organization, whatever it is. This might be a silly example, but think of how many times you have to remind yourself of the gospel, because it just sort of leaks sometimes, where like, I remember the finished work of Christ on the cross, and then I struggle and I doubt and and then I have to remind myself of the finished work of Christ on the cross. And I know it sounds dramatic, but I think we have to remind ourselves, and we're so used to giving ourselves to pride and a critical spirit, especially when it comes to the church. So this is a great opportunity to put some of those things in check, and to like have space and time, really good guided time to self-reflect, reflect on your organization, and then start building healthy relationships. I mean, we're stewards, y'all. Like, we are stewards of the resources that God has given us. And this includes the precious human resources of the church, of which we are a part. So we have to be humble, we have to be gentle, and cultivate that like humility and compassion. And this is a great place to do it. So I've been like 3 times. I would go again every time. It's so helpful. So I hope you guys will come. I hope to see you there.
I want to address a couple questions that we just didn't have time to get to, but they asked about stories from churches, case studies. At the MAC, we do a pastors panel, which is always one of the highest rated sessions. We bring in area pastors and we have a frank conversation about what it's like to work with agencies, the good and the bad, and sometimes even the ugly. Those are great opportunities to really put yourselves in the shoes of a church leader. Again, we have some case studies. Another thing was brought up is about mobilizing the whole church, not just the sending of missionaries. And that's definitely something we talk about. What does it look like as an organization to interact in such a way with a church where it's not just a one-dimensional approach to connection? There's maybe various ways that churches can tap into the expertise, value proposition, and opportunities of organizations. So we do talk about broader, what it looks like to mobilize the whole church, not just individuals. So I wanted to hit on those pieces there. I guess we're a little bit over, but we had good retention. Almost everyone stayed online, so they must not have tuned out. So that's great. So Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us today. Can't wait to see you in June. And Denny, it's a pleasure to swing swords with you, brother. Folks, thanks for taking the time today to be with us. Again, we hope this was a blessing, and we'd love to see you in Dallas in June. So I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615 signing off. Thanks, everyone, and may God bless the work of your hands as you seek to engage the bride of Christ in a meaningful and productive way. Amen. God bless.
Well, we hope you were blessed by what you heard today. To learn more about the ministry of 1615, log on to 1615.org. And by the way, be sure to like and subscribe.